Good evening. I have to confess to be feeling, not for the first time as a journalist, very much out of my depth and something of a fraud. It is, I think, that in the condition of being a journalist that we should always feel that way. But we have a panel tonight to discuss accountability in international law, international relations, and human rights across the world. A very, very distinguished panel, only in the order in which they are introduced on the website. I shall introduce them. We've got Philip Sands here, who's Professor of Laws and Director of the Centre of International Courts and Tribunals at University College London, and a number of other roles and distinctions which he will outline for us. We've got Janine Di Giovanni, very, very old friend, full disclosure here, of mine, a brilliant writer who took a pretty radical career change and now runs the Reckoning Project in Ukraine and elsewhere around the world in the realm of human rights. I shan't steal any more of her thunder. She can explain exactly what all of that means. And Ibrahim Olabi, who is a barrister who specializes in international law and is also something of an activist in on the Middle East and elsewhere. He's originally from Syria. And again, his personal story is very powerful, but also the areas in which he works are extremely important. And as ever, and we were talking about this earlier on, about how kind of timely perhaps this discussion is. I have been covering wars for, I think, 33 years or so. I can't really remember whether it's the Somali famine and American invasion of Somalia back in 1993, the Rwandan genocide, the fall of Yugoslavia, the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan. When was it not highly pertinent and timely to be discussing these issues? But in order to start things off and set the cat among the pigeons, one of the issues I have struggled with, and Janine and I, having covered many conflicts together, in fact, have often discussed this, is the extent to which, as journalists, we rely on human rights law, international law, as a kind of template or a framework against which to judge or give energy to pieces that we're writing in a conflict, about a conflict, to a wider audience in order for them to understand why it matters or why it's quote-unquote bad. And then at the same time, the kind of private feeling, which is that war is the end of reason. It is conflicts, particularly civil conflicts, can be deliberately and systematically grotesque, very targeted and malicious in the deliberate use of violence, both by militant groups and indeed by nation states or governments against their own peoples or their neighbors or peoples that they're responsible for. But in short, what is the point when international law seems to be so erratically applied and so difficult to enforce and so often fraught with cultural and political, geostrategic and very, very local concerns? And so that is the kind of context in which my colleagues on the panel here are seeking to find and then enforce accountability on people who have committed criminal acts in the international legal sense. And if I'd ask each panel member now, is going to spend about 5 minutes kind of laying out their stall, and then I'll start asking some questions, and then later on we'll open it up to the audience. Janine.
Good evening, and thank you so much for coming out. It's a real pleasure to see this room full, to hear a topic like accountability. So I began my career 33 years ago in Gaza, actually. I was an academic. I had no intention to become a journalist, and I was there during the first Intifada. My mentor was the great late human rights lawyer Felicia Langer, who had survived the Nazi death camps, went to Israel in, I think, 49, and then at one point became the only lawyer in Israel defending Palestinians in military court. And she sent me to Gaza. She gave me a list of contacts, Gaza and the West Bank. And my life changed forever. I basically came back. My private life changed forever, and my work life changed, and I became a journalist. And I stayed for 3 years, wrote a book, and then the war in Bosnia broke out. And Bosnia, as many of you who were there knew, Sam and I knew each other from Bosnia, was a heartbreaking war that, in the aftermath of it, where justice was not served. So I went on to cover many, many wars in the 33 years. Sam and I, actually, we met in Rwanda in '94 during the genocide, and then we were together in many other wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. So basically, like Sam, I think I've covered every violent conflict in most of the world since the late 80s, basically. But I'm the CEO and the executive director of an organization called the Reckoning Project. It was founded a few days after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And full disclosure, Ibrahim is our chief legal counsel, and Philippe is on our board as an advisory board member. So I'm surrounded by incredible legal experts. So it was founded because I was bitter and angry about how little justice had been brought to Bosnia, Rwanda, Syria, other conflicts, from having written books and dived deep into these conflicts and seeing these victims who never got justice. And I believe that without justice, there could never be healing. Without transitional justice, you would have war again in 20 or 30 years. So literally, I was phoned by Peter Pomerantsev, who's a British academic and expert on propaganda, and he said, he was born in Kyiv, and he said, "What can we do?" And I said, well, I just finished a project at the UN in Iraq and Syria, training doctors and first responders to understand what a war crime is so that they could take testimony that could be admissible in court. Because the thing about journalists like Sam and I, we were good reporters, our notebooks were good, but they really couldn't stand up in court. And I know this because we've both been called by Hague investigators numerous times. Sometimes I would just say to them, "You're calling me about something that happened 12 years ago. I don't remember." Or, "I don't have the notebook anymore." I'd be honest with them. So what we do at the Reckoning Project, we only use we mainly have investigative journalists, but we also have 4 lawyers on our team. We have social workers, and we train them to quite a high level. I mean, they're not lawyers when they get out, but they have a really clear understanding of IHL, international humanitarian law, and criminal law. We train them in trauma. We train them in how to take testimonies that will stand up with the ICC at the International Criminal Court and the Prosecutor General's office in Kyiv, Andrei Kostin, who we work very closely with. Sorry, I know I'm conscious of time. So what we do, once they're trained, and we have several trainings several times a year, and they become war crime investigators. They're no longer journalists. They are not acting as journalists when they're in the field for us. The minute something happens, like Bucha or Zaporizhzhia, they are in the field. They're taking testimonies. We then verify them using OSINT and all kinds of fancy tools that didn't exist in our day. We then archive them, and some of them, most of them, go to Ibrahim, who he has a team of 4 lawyers. They analyze them, and they decide which are going to go where, to the prosecutor, to a universal jurisdiction case, which he'll talk about, or to other international justice mechanisms like UN special rapporteurs or papers. The other half of them, which is quite important, which are ones that Ibrahim doesn't want, go to create media content, to influence audiences like the Global South, who are getting a very different narrative of the war in Ukraine. So we use it for advocacy purposes. Since the war started, we've got, I think it's jumped from 350 to
It's more than 400, I think.
more than 400 testimonies. We work directly with the Prosecutor General. We're talking to the ICC a lot. We have been working for the past year on the deported Ukrainian children, 19,000 of them. that have been deported to Russia as a way of eradicating Ukrainian identity. So I don't want to take up too much more time, but that's what we do at the Reckoning Project.
Philippe, as a kind of, along with Ibrahim, a legal practitioner here, and I don't want to preempt what you're going to say, but Janine in there was stimulating questions in me about the kind of structural challenges about pinning a case, getting accountability, but also the context. How do you define the various crimes? I wonder if that's something you might touch on anyway.
Sure. So again, it's really lovely to be here with you, Sam, and with Janine and with Ibrahim and with this lovely audience in this lovely club. You started with a sort of broader context. You might well ask, so what's the point of international law, given what we see today in our newspapers, podcasts, Twitter sphere, social media, TV, and so on and so forth? And I think it's a legitimate question to ask, but I think it's also worth going back to another era. Go back to the 1930s. And in the 1930s, the rules that Janine and Ibrahim and so many others rely on did not exist. There were not pieces of paper or treaties or agreements which said, this is what you can do, this is what you cannot do. And the difference between then and now, which leaves me feeling optimistic, for Janine knows I am an optimistic person, recognizing that, like so many things, the law is a long game, is that we have something today that did not exist a century ago. You could not have done what you do today in the 1930s. To illustrate anecdotally the moment where I recognized the significance, however inadequate the system is, and it is manifestly inadequate. You know that, Ibrahim, with your own personal experience better than anyone. It was a conversation I had in November 2019 with a man called Thomas Bergenthal, who had been and was recently retired as the American judge at the International Court of Justice. But he was originally from Poland, and he, as a 10-year-old, found himself in a place called Auschwitz under the care of a man, a doctor, called Joseph Mengele. He was one of Mengele's children. And we did a panel together at a university in Washington, D.C., and I was about to be involved in the hearings before the International Court of Justice on the case brought by the Gambia against Myanmar, alleging the crime of genocide in relation to the mistreatment of the Rohingya community. And Tom said, can you imagine, Philippe, if in 1944, when I was in that place called Auschwitz, there had been a faraway country, like the Gambia, who went to a faraway court in The Hague and said, actually, there's a treaty which says you can't treat these people in this way. Now, it may not seem like much, and it's certainly not enough, but it's a lot better than the alternative, because the alternative is nothing. Of course, another alternative is a system which is perfect and which works and which operates to end all impunity at all times, but we're obviously some way off from that. And I then went off to The Hague, and we argued for injunctive relief, request for provisional measures, which the court gave, and which did have the immediate effect of changing the behavior on the ground to a significant, but not complete extent, but nevertheless to a significant extent, of the treatment of the Rohingya, imposed reporting requirements on the government of Myanmar. And a few days later, and you can find it on the web, there was this extraordinary photograph that we were sent of hundreds of Rohingya in a camp at Cox's Bazar, standing with a hand-drawn poster saying, "Thank you, the Gambia." They felt noticed, they felt recognized, they felt legitimized. It's not everything. plainly, we would want much more. There's so much more that could be done. But it's a thought experiment. However inadequate is the system today, think of the alternative. It is a work in progress. It's a work in progress which allows someone like me, beyond the work that Janine and Ibrahim are doing, to write an article in the Financial Times within 3 days of the invasion of Ukraine, proposing the idea of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, to address the crime of aggression. And lo and behold, today, the Council of Europe is now engaged in a negotiation on a draft statute for a tribunal on the crime of aggression. It's a set of rules, however inadequate, and many of you will have read East-West Street, which talks about the origins of crimes against humanity and genocide, which nevertheless led to the creation of inadequate rules and an inadequate institution called the International Criminal Court, which recently was requested by the prosecutor to issue indictments in relation to, on one side, individuals associated with Hamas, and on the other side, individuals associated with the Israeli government. I can tell you for fact, from direct first-hand experience, that is not nothing. It has had a dramatic consequence in relation to the thinking of the actors on both sides. Perhaps not in the short term in the direction we may want. There is an argument that the emergence of international criminal law has the unintended consequence of causing individuals who are at risk of investigation, of indictment, of prosecution, of hanging on. I've seen that for myself firsthand. For 15 years, I was counsel for Croatia in relation to the crimes committed at Vukovar. Was it crimes against humanity? Was it war crimes? Was it genocide? You know all about the horrors that happened there. But the fact that the president of Croatia, fearing that there was a secret arrest warrant issued against him by the ICTY, did not travel to Germany for necessary medical treatment. And we have it closer to home also. Mr. Bush does not travel abroad. And one of the reasons he doesn't travel abroad is he knows he is at risk, and it's happened on 2 occasions where visits have been cancelled, of being questioned about waterboarding and torture. Mr. Blair has to take a certain degree of care in terms of where he goes in the world in relation to allegations of the crime of aggression, in relation to an illegal war in Iraq. It may not be much, but it's more than nothing. And if you imagine a long game, it opens the path towards a better place. When I was a student, when I was a research fellow, a young academic, getting up and running in international law, I was based at a college in Cambridge called St. Catherine's, and I had a colleague there, wonderful English legal historian called John Baker, Sir John Baker. And he would occasionally summon me for lunch and ask me what I was working on. And I'd say, oh, I'm doing this or that and the other. And he'd say, oh, yes, yes, yes. We had a similar problem in English law in 1378, and it took 295 years to sort it out. And that's where we are in the world of international law. So don't give up, keep plugging away. It's a long game. Inadequate, but necessary.
Thank you, Philippe. Inadequate but necessary, and hopefully not quite the snail's pace of feudal reform in the United Kingdom. Well, wasn't even the United Kingdom back then. But Ibrahim, you face this task both in terms of theory, but also in terms of personal experience and absolute practicality. How does that bear on your life, both working and personal, perhaps?
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you for such a large audience that I honestly would not have imagined on the issue of international law. Which shows that we are living in kind of historical times where this is becoming so important. I want to come and build up what Philippe has said, but slightly from a different perspective. Depending on the mood of the day, in order for me to continue working, I need to feel a sense of purpose as to what is the point. I work with torture survivors, the mothers, the fathers, We interview them, we speak to them, they're real. And they have expectations in a way. So why should they care about international law, and what sort of answer can I give? And I often try and think, on the kind of pessimistic days, as to why does Putin care? Why did Putin, when he started his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, start with a speech? I'm just going to invite you to go have a look at it, but don't. Where he said, I recognize this territory, and they're inviting me under Article 51 of the UN Charter for Self-Defense. Why is he citing international law? Why is China today citing international law in relation to what's happening in Lebanon? Why did Antony Blinken, on one of the anniversaries of the Geneva Conventions that we just celebrated, tweet the importance of the Geneva Conventions at a time where everyone is calling out the US for double standards? They're not dumb. They know that's going to be called out in that sense. So why do states that have the guns, have the power, need international law? Why do they care about it? I don't claim to know the full reason, but whatever the reason is, then so should we. If they're trying to hold onto it, to try and say, we need some sort of language that we're able to speak together, I need some sort of objective measure to call out my opponent, to say, you're breaching something that I'm holding on to, then how can we use that system to kind of push ahead? The regimes that we're dealing with today are all engaging one way or the other with the international system, because I think, in the same question that Philippe asked you, what is the alternative? They know the alternative is going back to absolute lawlessness. And that, from at least numerical, economic numbers, has severe, severe consequences on the world. So they're trying to kind of hold on to it in whichever way that they can. And our role is to be able to kind of objectively use that as a common language to rally people. The fact that in the core group for the Court of Aggression on Ukraine, there's another 40-odd countries, for example, they speak probably 30 different languages. But they're able to sit in a meeting and agree using some sort of language. On a project that I'm working on relating to kind of chemical weapons, I was in Sierra Leone, I was in Tokyo, I was in Costa Rica trying to rally governments. And whichever minister I managed to speak to, they all understood what I was referring to when I was talking about the Chemical Weapons Convention, about the universality of chemical weapons. It is a standard that at least allows us to kind of start these conversations and hold them to account at the international level. But then I also think about kind of perpetrators from a domestic perspective. As you've heard, I'm Syrian. I grew up in different parts of the world, and I was supposed to go on a journey of kind of commercial law, but then Syria started, and I decided to kind of shift focus completely doing university. But while I wanted to study law, is to speak to my Syrian friends who kind of grew up in Syria, and they're like, you have good A-level equivalent results. Why do you want to go into law? That's something that, is so socially stigmatized. You need to in Syria and a lot of Arab countries, you need to barely pass your kind of A-level equivalent to be able to get into law. And that, in my opinion, with the exception of the few that did it and went into it and kind of fought against there's a social stigma of becoming a lawyer in dictatorship countries because they know it challenges the status quo. It equips you with the knowledge, with the facts, with the things that you need in order to be able to push back. And those Syrians that went into law and studied hard and being able to kind of resist the regime and so on, defied a lot of social stigma, defied no career prospects, because if you go into international law, you work for the government, right? You represent the regime at the UN or something along these lines. There are no real prospects in that. So whether we look at it from an international level or at the domestic level, it seems like international law still matters, and that those who are even the perpetrators care about it. And that kind of brings me to the point where I think we are facing historical times when it comes to the institutions that we have developed. As Philippe has said, it is not nothing to get requests for arrest warrants against a full arrest warrant against one of the largest countries in the world, Russia, and a request for an arrest warrant against President Netanyahu. That is, I go to The Hague every week. People are almost sweating. Is the ICC still going to exist? Are people going to sanction it? What's going to happen? Is the institution going to end? Are we going backwards? And that fear shows in my opinion, I'm listening to hear your thoughts, that at least we survived that couple of weeks or couple of months in that and still holding it together. The US reaction could have been far more drastic, as we've seen under President Trump, when he sanctioned the prosecutor to the International Criminal Court, who's now the ambassador to the UK, actually, the Gambian ambassador to the UK, Fatou Bensouda here. So it clearly matters to perpetrators, and it clearly does empower victims to be able to do something. And the story that, and I'll finish with that, the story that Philippe has mentioned, I have experience in a similar situation where the Netherlands and Canada decided to take Syria to the International Court of Justice over the Torture Convention. The mass torture in Syria, under, again, the similar provision. It's not about Dutch nationals, it's not about Canadian nationals, but it's about, for them, how did this Dutch legal advisor convince his minister to take this? I don't know how much Syria or Syrians were on the table, to be perfectly honest. I know the legal advisors and all their team, and I know how much they care about Syria and Syrians. But is that really, in our day and age, in 2019, a politically sellable argument? As a Syrian, I tell you no. I know it's not. I know we're not on the map, unfortunately. But there's something about maintaining this kind of rule-based order that if it starts the Chemical Weapons Convention, then the Genocide Convention, then the UN Charter, then the Torture Convention, the things that so many countries have ratified and signed, then the whole system is going to break. That's from a state perspective. But on that date, which unfortunately was the 10th of October, because we got emails, and I'm saying unfortunately, we got emails when victims' mothers and fathers were outside The Hague holding pictures of people they will never see again. These people who had died in torture, yet waving the Dutch flag, saying, "Thank you, Netherlands," who rallied from different parts of Europe to stand in front of the ICJ. And they chose pictures of their loved ones before they died. So not the skeleton Caesar pictures that some of you might have seen, so the pictures that leaked after death. They want to remember them as they once were, and are still there believing in this process, knowing that it's not going to get the perpetrators, but they're fully believing in it. At the same time, we get texts from media, from journalists, non-responsible journalists, unlike yourself, who say, Syria, and I quote, "Sorry, Syria is cancelled because of October 7 events." So not like that way, for that reason, we didn't even get the coverage to be able to show the world, but they still knew, they still came, the victims and the survivors, and they still rallied. And that should matter for something. If a mother is willing to look at the picture of her son, do that trip on a bus from God knows where in Europe, hold it outside the International Court of Justice, and thank the Netherlands, then that means something, and we must try to hold on to it as much as we can so that we don't suffer the consequences.
Well, I began this introduction with a rather cynical and world-weary view, and I have to say the passion, the intelligence, and the examples that all of the panelists have shown actually beginning to reignite a little bit of optimism in this fat old man. So that, if nothing else has gone, I've had a great evening so far. I feel like maybe I should get out now. But in that context, Janine, could you kind of drill down for me, with the assistance perhaps of your colleagues, into the aspects of law that you like to be, that you use in your work, and then the process perhaps of getting accountability without obviously getting too stuck in the weeds. I'm really interested in the challenges, and then later we'll come on to the kind of regional biases and things that would affect us. There are going to be questions from the audience. I know you're all on tenterhooks. Janine.
Yeah, so thank you, my two colleagues. That was just really inspiring. And I mean, sometimes I wake up and the challenge of what we're doing is overwhelming. And I do feel like you. I think, why don't I just give it up and write a novel or something and just, not that that's easy. Okay, so...
I make chutney.
Sorry, no, but... All right, so the real challenge for us is the sheer level. We're just working in Ukraine right now, but we will use the methodology, which we've refined, to go to other places, and especially places where I feel they have been overlooked, like Sudan. So the real challenge is the number of criminal activity. The Prosecutor General's office in Kyiv, it's now up to 129,000 incidents. So when we break this down and we're looking at projects, what are we going to work on? Okay, we spent 1 year just diving into the children. And that is children So for those of you who don't know, what happened is that when the Russians took over towns like Mariupol, they would go to the orphanages or the care centers. And in Ukraine, like many Eastern European countries, children who had special needs were often just placed in these places, which weren't very kind, let's put it that way. And you could also leave your child there if you were an alcoholic or you were divorced and you couldn't. So there were many, many kids in these homes. The Russians came and they went straight for them, as well as baby hospitals, maternity hospitals. They loaded the kids into buses and they took them sometimes in parts to various parts of Russia. So some of them went to Rostov, some of them then got out at Rostov, took trains to Moscow, from there went to the Far East, and they were placed in orphanages throughout Russia with the intent that they would gave up their documents, they gave up their Ukrainian names. If they were old enough to speak, they could not speak Ukrainian anymore, which you know is a very different language from Russian. They had to speak Russian. And they were put up for adoption. Now, adoption is a big business in Russia. There's money behind it. But there was also a bigger intent, which I'm going to let Philippe and Ibrahim speak to, which is the eradication of this identity of being Ukrainian, which is what, you know, Putin's big thing. There is no Ukraine. There is little Russia. There is no Ukrainian people. And, you know, whether their culture, their language, their history speaks against that, this is what Putin wants. You know, he wants the eradication of being Ukrainian. So these kids, and I just came from Kyiv where I was at the First Ladies Conference on this subject of children, with Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor at the ICC, and with Kostin. And it is a grave crime because what are children? Children are the future, right? So if you take children out of a country, and 19,000 of them. Now that's the figure we use, but others off the record say it could be as high as 35,000, if not more. So what do? We get testimonies from the people who last saw these kids before they were put on the buses, before they got on the Russian railroads and went to Moscow. We had one case of a father who was trying to flee Mariupol with his 3 kids, and he was stopped at a checkpoint. He was taken off to a filtration camp, which is something like a prison where they try to determine if you're working for the Ukrainian forces. He was taken there, and his 3 kids were put on the bus and taken to an orphanage in Moscow. After a few months, by some force of sheer will, the eldest kid, Matvey, got a cell phone, remembered the number of his father's boss, and phoned him and said, "Where's my dad? We're in Moscow." And the boss said, "He's in Latvia. He got out of the jail. He's now in Latvia." Anyway, the father went to Moscow, got the kids, and they've come out. And we're now getting kids that are beginning to come back from Russia. Putin's defense will be that anyone that wants to come get their kid can get them. But the fact is, they lose communication. Many of them went to the Crimea as well. And once they kind of cross the Ukrainian border, if they have cell phones, they're taken away from them. They're taken, some of them, to the Far East, you know, time zones away from where their families are. And some of them are tiny. They're babies, or they're under the age of 3, so they can't speak, or they can't remember their parents' names. So this is what we've been focused on. And of course, this is one of the causes behind Putin's indictment at the Hague, is the deportation of the children. I'll turn over to these guys.
I'd like to take your perch. The indictment of Vladimir Putin by the International Criminal Court in an open arrest warrant. I think it was a terrible mistake. And I want to put the other side of the coin now. I am not starry-eyed about international law. I'm not starry-eyed about international criminal law or international criminal justice. What were the events that led to that request for an arrest warrant? After the occupation of Ukraine began, beyond what had happened in 2014, the calls for the creation of a special criminal tribunal on the crime of aggression grew. Why? There are 4 international crimes: aggression, war crimes, wrong methods and means of war, crimes against humanity, harms against individuals, genocide, harms against groups. The International Criminal Court, for technical legal reasons, does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression in relation to what has happened in Ukraine. The crime of aggression is, amongst many grave crimes, probably the most significant because, as with the judgment at Nuremberg, it was the act which started all the crimes that followed and which fall within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Against that background, we began to hear noises that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court was opposed to a special criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression. And it became clear that it had nothing to do with an issue of principle. I'm sorry, we've got to call a spade a spade. It had nothing to do with an issue of principle. It was simply about turf and ego. The crime of aggression is the quickest way to get to the top table. It's a leadership crime. It is easy to prove, and it leads straight to Mr. Putin, Mr. Shoigu, the head of the FSB, and a very small number of other men, probably no women. There is a big gender issue in international criminal law also. And so, to head off the creation of a special criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression, the powers that be within the prosecutor's office in the International Criminal Court took the view we'd better find a way to get to Putin, to show that we don't need such an institution because we can deal with it. Now, I'm a parent. I have 3 kids. Deporting children is a crime under international law, and it's a serious and terrible crime. But very frankly, in the scheme of horrors that has happened in the last 2 years, it is not top of my list in terms of all the horrors. My sense is that the prosecutor did not get authorization from a pretrial chamber of judges to go for other crimes against humanity or war crimes. That was all they could get Putin for. And the error has been compounded by going for a public arrest warrant. Why was it not done in secret? You should be asking yourself that question. As happened in the 1990s, very effectively, I mentioned Croatia and Mr. Tudjman, same with Milosevic and with others, they didn't know who had been indicted. And it made them anxious, and it had a powerful effect. Why did the ICC prosecute publicly and openly? For publicity reasons. You probably remember the images when that was announced. The prosecutor, the president of the International Criminal Court were front and center, portraits, photographs. Why on earth is that going on? Why is that happening? We should be focusing on the substance of these issues. And that leads to the second problem. Having publicly indicted one serving head of state, you then come to the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Whoa, you don't indict anyone at the top in relation to that issue. They're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. So he has created for himself a rod across his back, which is absurd. The indictment of the Hamas people, of the Israeli leadership, should have been a secret indictment. You would not know who has been indicted, and frankly, you don't need to know who has been indicted, unless you want to demonstrate that you are acting in order to be able to resist the pressure. The point that I'm making is nothing is ever quite what it seems. The reasons things happen, why they happen in the way that they do, are not necessarily in the best interests of international criminal justice. And my own view is that the public indictment of Messrs. Putin, Netanyahu, Sinha is deeply unhelpful. It creates a backlash. We've all seen that backlash. Within Israel and within the Palestinian community, the indictments have had the opposite effect. They've allowed support to be rallied for individuals who, in my opinion, very plainly are associated with the commission of international crimes. Why is that a socially useful thing to do when you could do it by other means? The question answers itself. What I'm suggesting is that however much we may wish for an international criminal justice system that is effective and workable, let us also not shirk our responsibilities in holding to account those who use the system or take the system in a direction which over the long term causes exactly the difficulty that Ibrahim said. He goes to The Hague and people are frankly terrified. Why did it need to be done in that way? It didn't need to be done in that way, except if you don't do it in that way, you get no publicity. And the publicity is the oxygen that was being sought in those two cases, I think, very unhelpfully. Secret indictments would have been just as effective, that we would not know precisely who has been targeted works incredibly effectively.
Janine, you've been itching
Yeah,
to
I just have a question for you or for Ibrahim. But having Netanyahu and Putin under the yoke of the law, okay, in Netanyahu's case, he scoffs at it and doesn't take it seriously, but Putin is not sitting...
That is not true. I can tell you for fact, he is incandescent
Yes, he's
with rage
angry, but
and
he's not,
anxiety.
he's
and he is
angry.
deeply worried about it. He is deeply, deeply,
But wait,
deeply
can I
worried
ask a
about it.
question? Doesn't this, I mean, I remember talking to someone in Ukraine about this. This makes Putin sit very uncomfortably in his seat. He cannot go to the south of France and go on a shot. He's not at the General Assembly in New York this week. They will not be comfortable. They can't travel. And it also sends a strong message, which is what I believe in, which is that perpetrators will be caught.
But they wouldn't travel if you had secret indictments. If the prosecutor simply says, I've issued 7 indictments in relation to this matter, they are sealed, I'm not telling you who they are, I can assure you those people would curtail their travel.
I remember Yugoslavia, though, and I remember everyone wandering around paranoid, you know, am I on the indictment list? Ibrahim wants to speak. But
Sam, may I very briefly?
Please go for it, yeah. We are going to go to questions any second.
I think this whole conversation goes around, in my opinion, as on the incentive structure as to why we're doing it. What's the point of it? Are we seeing it as what is the outcome that those who work on international criminal law, those who support it, or states that, or victims that are part of it? And I think people come at it from very, very different perspectives. I gave up on outcomes. I no longer outcomes in the sense of court indictments in the context of Syria. I don't personally believe them. I still work towards them. And for me, the kind of coping mechanism and the incentive structure to continue, other than marrying a clinical psychologist, which helped, was the idea that the process matters, the fight matters. That is, for me, accountability. A few things that has happened since the slightly older cases, in my opinion, is we have grown far more impatient. We live in a generation where if it's a 10-second video, I no longer watch it if it's not 3 or it doesn't get my attention in the first 2 seconds. We want results. We know more. Far more people have died in previous wars, as you said. Statistically, the numbers are less now. So could that mean deterrence is working? I don't know. But at least from a numbers perspective, it's less. But we see the images. We see that numbers don't matter for a grieving mum or dad or parent. So in a way, different people are viewing it differently. And so for us at the Reckoning Project, I think a good case to kind of illustrate that is that when we've seen something that I've unfortunately seen in the situation of Syria is that our pain and suffering, the pain and suffering of the victims and survivors, it's not just the actual pain and suffering, and not all the kind of indirect and indirect pain, but it's also getting your pain and the crime that happened to you dismissed as political, as double standards, as this is just an East versus West issue. And I've quickly seen this pain materialize in Ukraine as like, okay, no, this is just a European war, it's okay for these crimes, as if crimes are geographically kind of triggered or just you can just filter them by geography, which you can't. They're supposed to be international conventions binding everyone. So the idea is that we wanted to kind of affect that narrative, and so we took a torture survivor. It was a horrific process to decide on which one. It's not a fun, that sifting exercise that Janine talked about. Very hard judgments that need to, what makes a good witness is how horrific the situation was and their ability to talk about it in an eloquent way, something which, my wife tells me, is not the normal situation, because when you're traumatized, you become less of a good witness, given good between quotation marks. So we found the suitable witness for this. He flew with us from Kyiv to Buenos Aires, and we filed the case there. He knew there's nothing that's going to come out of it. He knows that the arrest warrants are going to be hard to get. He knows, but he was happy to bring his pain and suffering thousands of miles away to be able to file that in a case. We decided to report on that case, and we managed to get Reuters to cover it accurately, because I think that's also the issue there. A lot of people confuse courts, say arrest warrants are out when they're not, different things are happening. It is just a complaint. It's not the Argentines now they are, but it wasn't then. It was just a submission, but that sent a message of resilience, of resistance, of victims not giving up. So for him, knowing it's not a financial reward, putting his life at risk, if you Google, Ukraine, torture, Argentina, you'll get a picture of a very hooded man with glass. There's no fame in it, even for him, in that. Illustrates, to me personally, that the fight against impunity is very much that. It's a fight. We're fighting impunity. We're promoting accountability. We're showing that we're not going to give up. And if if victims are not giving up, if they're willing to go through so much pain and suffering and re-traumatization, and they're not giving up, then neither should we.
So, I want to try and move it on, because I think we've got the very interesting it's not a tension, but a slight difference in approach, interesting philosophical, the process versus the outcome. But I wanted very quickly, before we go to questions, to ask particularly the legal brains on the panel, but it very much applies to Janine's work too, is the big subject terminology, genocide, in particular, crimes against humanity. As a journalist, I see these terms bandied about with incredible and frankly grotesque abandon by some of my colleagues, and I have personally witnessed the unfolding. I was among the bad guys when they were doing the killing in Rwanda, and that was a very clear case of genocide that the international community, in the form of the West at any rate, elected to officially not use the term because it would have triggered the obligation to intervene and stop it, and because it came a year or so, or less than a year after the Black Hawk Down disaster in Mogadishu, it seems that the United States backed away alongside Britain and others in the whole terminology. But now it's being applied, both in terms of the international criminal courts and in terms of the media, to both, to some extent, there are crimes of genocide going on in Ukraine, and in the case, deliberately speaking under correction here, and in the case of Gaza, Israel is being accused of the grand crime, if you like, of genocide. Philippe, I wonder if you could speak to that.
I'd be very happy to speak to it, but I just want to come back because I'm so interested by what Ibrahim has said. And of course, I'm completely with you, but beware what you hope for. Because the case that you have described, which I've followed in the media, I didn't know you were involved, and it's chapeau, it's an amazing thing that you've done. Fast forward, it's based on a principle known as universal jurisdiction. The idea that the courts of any country in the world can exercise jurisdiction over crimes that are considered to be so heinous that there must be no place of refuge. Crimes against humanity, genocide, to a certain extent, war crimes, torture, and other things. That's the story of Pinochet, which I'm particularly interested in because I'm publishing a book in April on the Pinochet case in London. And of course, we get to a point in the Pinochet case where, after years of pursuing him, after getting him indicted, after getting him arrested, after getting him to be held and detained Here in London, not so far from where we are, he returns to Chile on grounds of ill health. And I can tell you, from the people that I've been speaking with, that act of return has been devastating. Devastating. And it's not at all a way in my part of saying it should never have happened. That's not what I'm saying. Nor am I, of course, saying you should not have been engaged in this particular exercise. But as a lawyer, we have a particular responsibility, and I'm sure you will have acquitted yourself in that, of warning people of what happens when it goes belly up and the consequences. And that is the issue in relation to genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes prosecuted at the international level. I was counsel for Palestine in the case on the right of self-determination before the International Court of Justice recently concluded, ruling that the occupation of the West Bank and of Gaza is manifestly illegal under international law. I was not involved in the case brought by South Africa against Israel in relation to genocide. That case was brought very simply because there is no other way to get a case on these kinds of issues, I use the term very loosely, to the International Court of Justice. You can't bring a case for war crimes to the International Court of Justice. No, people just don't know this. You can't bring a case for crimes against humanity to the International Court of Justice. So you have to shoehorn your case into the concept of genocide. Pause for a moment. Many of you will have read East-West Street. You'll know that genocide is in my DNA, in a certain sense. I've also argued most of the cases on genocide at the International Court of Justice, and mostly lost them, because no state has ever been found to be responsible for genocide before the International Court of Justice. Because the test the International Court of Justice has applied up at this point establishes so high a threshold that it has never been possible to prove that the only intention that motivates the act is to destroy the group in whole or in part. And in a case where a country exercises the right of self-defense, which Israel has done excessively, in my view, and manifestly in violation of war crimes laws and crimes against humanity laws, the argument will be it was not the only intention. And therefore, in legal terms, it's not characterized as genocide. The horrible reality is that there is, and you've alluded to this, a wide gulf between what regular smart folk consider to be genocide and the, frankly, rather horrible definition of genocide in international law, which makes it impossible to prove. The media, who are really not very attentive to these kinds of things, focus on the prosecutor's indictments in relation to Hamas and in relation to Israel. I have not seen a single article address the fact that the prosecutor, Mr. Karim Khan, did not indict for genocide on either side. He knows how difficult it is to prove genocide. Now imagine we now have two courts in The Hague proceeding with these cases. The ICC actually has jurisdiction over genocide. It didn't prosecute or seek an arrest warrant for genocide. What signal does that send to the judges of the International Court of Justice of the claim of genocide? I don't know exactly the answer to the question, but it sends a signal. And if you take the trouble to read, not out of context, as most of the journalists have done, what the International Court of Justice has said in its successive provisional measures orders, and you take the trouble to go on the web and read the separate but concurring opinion, for example, of Judge Nolte, the German judge, it's very easy to find and read it, it's 3 or 4 pages, you will see that there is a fair prospect that at the end of the day, the International Court of Justice will find in relation to Gaza there is no genocide. And that will be devastating. It will be devastating for those who have hitched their wagon to the genocide claim. And they're perfectly entitled to. I'm not in any way criticizing. If South Africa wants to bring a case for genocide, fine. But be aware that proving it is another thing. And if you fail to prove it, you will let a lot of people down, leave a lot of people feeling, what the shit? We spent 5 years litigating this thing, or 15 in the case of Croatia versus Serbia, and we lost because the ICJ ruled in the end that what happened at Vukovar was crimes against humanity, but was not genocide. A decision I think was wrong, but which nevertheless is the decision, and therefore I have to respect. And I can tell you today, in Croatia, people are seriously pissed off. The Bosnians got a genocide for Srebrenica, and they didn't get a genocide. They only got a crime against humanity. So again, the long-term unintended consequences of bandying words around, making claims, arguing cases, running cases, can be absolutely devastating, and they will have their long-term consequences. And that has to be put into the equation, I think, when you're thinking about using these claims or making these cases. Just to be very clear, this is not in any sense a criticism of anyone who's involved in any of those cases. It's simply saying, from the perspective of someone who has spent 30 years arguing cases at these international courts, be aware of what a possible outcome may be and prepare your client for the woeful consequences of failure.
Well, I was optimistic. Thanks for that, Philippe. No, but they're very, very interesting and subtle points you're making there, which I certainly, as a member of the media, have always failed to appreciate. Janine, very quickly,
Yes,
because I do want to get to questions.
I will wrap up. It's a very good point, and our researchers often come to us and say, but why aren't we going for the crime of genocide? And we constantly say to them, lower the bar, because it is incredibly difficult to prove. But I just want to make one point about accountability and impunity. Every single one of those 400 testimonies that we have in our archive, behind that is a person. It's someone that trusted us to give us their story, and we owe them something. So when we think, okay, is this ever going to get anywhere? We owe it to them to at least try to bring it to some kind of pathway of international justice, because I have been haunted for the past 30 years by all of those women in Foča that I interviewed from the rape camps at Foča. There were 16,000 women raped, sometimes several times a day, with the intention to get pregnant. 24 men went to The Hague. So those women live every day with this sense of justice that was never delivered. We're never going to deliver justice to the 139,000 incidents in Ukraine. It's impossible. But I think messaging is hugely important, and the fact that justice is working, that we haven't, because the 1990s, we were so cynical. There was Srebrenica, there was Rwanda, there was Somalia. There were so many horrible wars. Congo, wars that we're not even talking about. Sierra Leone, Liberia. And people went back to their lives after hideous atrocities had been committed. I mean, most of the crimes in our archive are actually torture. It's not the deportation, it's torture. How do you go back to society? How do you begin to live again after this has happened to you and justice, or some form of justice, is not in motion? So I just, with all the cynicism that we have, or the disbelief that there ever will be any kind of cycle of justice, I just have to say, we have to try. We have to try.
Right, let's open to questions. You caught me in the side of my eye first. Gentleman in the black shirt there. Yeah, maybe. Sorry.
Hello, I'm Khan Ross. Greetings to all of you, and just to take a moment to thank you for all of your extraordinary and important work. I think it's so important, and I'm so glad you're doing it. My question is about this place, the UK. I share your view that we're making progress internationally, albeit conditionally, in the pursuit of accountability. Where we're not making progress is here, in the UK, this country of law. I testified to 2 Iraq inquiries that the government lied about the war and broke international law and avoided alternatives to war. And today we see this government and the previous Tory government supplying weapons to a country that is undoubtedly committing war crimes in Gaza without any fear of true legal accountability. If that is the case, and perhaps Philippe, Ibrahim in particular, but also I'd love your comments, Janine, what can we do? What can we as British citizens do? The lack of accountability is brazen and in your face. Tony Blair speaks at conferences, he's interviewed by the BBC. Alistair Campbell, the perpetrator of the lie, has a popular podcast. He presented Channel 4's election coverage. It's not just legal accountability that is lacking, there's also cultural accountability. The public's accountability, who clearly feel that these people should get away with it. And I don't understand it, and I feel very frustrated about it.
Ibrahim?
I mean, I would just give an example, but Philippe is far more experienced than I am in this. The UK, the former government, set a trend when it came to the recent ICC request for arrest warrant. And they submitted that they said they want to intervene on a question whether Palestine has the right to kind of delegate some on a technicality. It's a technicality that has huge implications. That led to, I don't know how many submissions that the court received, right? So a lot of other countries got excited, and that slowed down the process that we have now. Driving around, listening to Capital music, right? I hear, as breaking news, that the new government has withdrawn what it had said to the ICC and is no longer filing this, right? You've already set a trend, so unfortunately the situation doesn't look very good in terms of the amount of countries that the previous government excited, but that shows that something is working. And that technicality is important, in my opinion. It makes a difference to show the world cares where the UK stands on legal questions. So here just as a small example that pressure does work. You're able to get your voices heard. There are avenues that you're able to kind of push this through. I never dreamt of the day when I was in law school that I'd hear both the ICJ and the ICC on a music channel in the UK. It's happening. It means the public is interested. It means that's something that they think you guys care about when you're voting, when you're writing letters to your MP, and so on. So clearly there is an avenue. How much you can use it is a question that I'll put to Philippe.
So it's already, just a couple of months on, not very fashionable to say nice things about this new government. But actually, they have shifted. They have shifted. And they've shifted in material ways. What you gave as an example of having withdrawn the intervention requesting the judges of the International Criminal Court to cease and desist in the possible issuance of an arrest warrant in relation to any Israeli nationals, because Israel is not a party to the Statute of International Criminal Court, they withdrew it under intense pressure from various quarters. They did it, and they will pay a price over time for doing that. They have also, some would say it's not enough, but they have suspended some arms licenses in relation to certain armaments being sold, and they've got a lot of flack from that for some quarters. Again, many people, perhaps including in this room, would say they didn't go far enough, they should have gone further, they should have done this. But this has not happened before. In relation to other cases in which I'm involved at the International Court of Justice, the United Kingdom has withdrawn, under the new government, submissions made by the previous government. And so there is a change taking place. It may not be enough to please everybody, but it's significant. And I think Ibrahim is absolutely right. That is a consequence of pressure. And that is a consequence of individuals writing to MPs, individuals voting for candidates who are opposed to what is going on over there, and making Labour candidates who are favoured to win and even get cabinet seats lose. And that is a form of accountability. I can't miss the moment also, just to draw to your attention, I can't say very much, but some of you will have read another book I wrote called The Lost Colony, about the removal of the entire population of Chagossians from the former British colony of Mauritius and the subsequently created new colony. For the last 2 years, the previous government, let us give them credit, and this government have been negotiating a resolution of that issue. And I'm not pessimistic about the outcome. Why did that happen? Why did Britain, which severed a part of its former colony of Mauritius and create a new colony called the British Indian Ocean Territory, after 50 years and an ICJ ruling, suddenly change position? Curiously, because of Russia and Ukraine. And you may ask yourself, well, why did they change position in relation to Russia and Ukraine? And the answer is very simple. They went, the British, to African countries and said, please help us end this illegal Russian occupation of Ukraine. And as a significant South African ambassador said to me, it's really interesting, Philippe. They came to us, they made their pitch, and we said to them, let's see if we've understood this correctly. You want us to help you bring to an end Russia's illegal occupation of Ukraine, whilst at the same time, in the face of a ruling of the International Court of Justice, you persist in your illegal occupation of the Chagos Archipelago, part of Mauritius and Africa. We don't think so. Fuck off. That's what happened. You go to any Security Council debate on Russia-Ukraine, the Russians, the Chinese, and their mates just say, you talk about Russia and Ukraine. Chagos, you're illegally occupying part of Africa. No one here knows about Chagos. It's the point that you make. No one here knows what our own country has done. But I want to give them credit because they are responding to domestic and international pressure, and it's having an impact. And if it pans out that they resolve it, I think they deserve plaudits for doing that, unlike other countries, which thus far have not changed position. So I'm less pessimistic than you, Ross. I mean, you're very well placed, and you know I'm 100% with you on Iraq. But it's not entirely bleak. There are things that are happening which are indeed responsive to public pressure and external international pressure.
Politics trumping principle once again. Pramvira's got the mic. She's in charge.
Sorry, I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. So my name's Ron. I've had the, I would say, pleasure to work with victims and survivors of atrocity crimes in Iraq, in Syria, elsewhere. And I had a question that was actually picking up on what Philippe and Ibrahim was saying on what accountability looks like. And I say accountability and not justice because I think to a certain extent justice ends once a crime is actually committed. But how do you then, when doing your work, Janine, how do you reconcile with that disagreement on what accountability looks like? And how do you set expectations for victims that are providing those testimonies? And what do you say to them, and how do you translate what accountability looks like to them? Because I believe every victim has an idea of what accountability looks like, but it's not standardized in a way.
Me? So the first thing when we're training our researchers is do not promise anything. And if you've ever worked in a refugee camp, or even as journalists, when people would come to us and beg us, take my child, get me out of the country, please bring my case to justice. We can't promise anything. We just say, we're taking the testimony, we will make sure it gets in the right hands, but we don't say we're going for the crime of genocide or we're going to bring you to The Hague. And what's interesting is we thought at first when we were devising our template for our questionnaire that most people wouldn't want to talk because they'd be afraid. But it's extraordinary the number of people that do want to talk. And we always say to them as well, and this is the same as when we were journalists, if someone doesn't want to talk to you, you can't force them. And then there's also the issue of trauma, right? You cannot take a testimony from someone who's deeply traumatized. So the immediate aftermath of, say, a rocket attack in Kramatorsk, you have to wait until they're giving you a clear line of thought. So I think the expectations have to really be managed. We have to be really careful when we're working with our, I hate the word victims, survivors. And I think, Ibrahim, we're trying to work now, can I say this, on a project with victims, which I think is hugely important to transitional justice. So I think you can speak to that better than me.
May I come in
Yeah.
very briefly?
Quickly as you can, because we want to get some more questions in.
Thank you, Roman, for your question. And I think I also don't no longer, unfortunately, use the word justice. It's not something that I can use in contexts like I can use it in panels like this, but not when when I'm working, unfortunately, because I think, you know, the saying goes, you kill, you know, a couple of hundred people might end up in The Hague. You kill 100,000, you end up in a peace conference, right? This is where they invite you then to figure out, well, what is the punishment? What sort of, and this was, you know, something that Philippe has said, you know, when there's an overpromising of a specific brand, why are we caring about that category of crime? Because if the punishment, if the kind of real concrete outcome is, life imprisonment or a death penalty for a war crime or a crime against humanity or genocide, I mean, you can't make it more than that. Why are we then pursuing terms that we might not be able to get? And that's a question of how victims see it. From our perspective, and for me personally, all what I can promise is that I will do my best. I will keep the fight. That's it. When we did it on torture victims and survivors and so on, all what I tell them is that what I can guarantee you is that I will do my best to keep your issue alive, to keep the issue on, if they want to. For others, justice was just ended. I don't want to be remembered. I want to start my new life in Germany or France or wherever I am, and I don't want to be reminded of what's going on. And I think this is where it really matters with each person as to where they are in that sense. And I'll just very briefly, in 2 lines, build on something that Philippe has said in relation to the kind of cases that we have. Because a lot of people were like, the double standards. On Ukraine, you're doing so much, why you're not doing on other things? I hope this doesn't get taken out of context. I like double standards. I think double standards are useful to call out hypocrisy. I hope I don't practice double standards, but I like double standards because it allows us to say, you've done X and Y. It sets the bar high in one case that then allows us to be able to push, well, you've done it there. Why are you not doing it here? If I didn't have countries acting with double standards, you would not be able to call it out. You would not be able to call out hypocrisy that then moves the lower standard to the highest standard that we need. One of the US ambassadors at large, Beth Van Schack, she said, you know, the high water, it raises all the boats with it. And I think that's what we need to. We need to be able to capitalize on double standards and on hypocrisy to actually get them to deliver more on cases, not deliver less on other just causes.
We're going to take
two more questions here.
one after the other.
Thank you for letting me speak today. My great-grandfather fought in the 20s during the First World War in Belgium, and my question to you is how do you think my Jewish religion and Israel feels with the media hate against Israel and the media controlling the Ukraine and the Russia war, and how can the Ukraine win the war with Russia with the media encouraging to carry on fighting? And after meeting Terry Waite and John McCarthy, after hearing their inspiration stories, how you like it if you were taken hostage on October the 7th in Israel last year, with Israel trying to help them be released, where the British government isn't willing to release the hostage. Let me finish. And and how dare the let me finish. How dare the South African take the Israel to the International Criminal Court when Putin took me in the restaurant for his war crimes against Ukraine?
Yeah, we'll back that up. We'll take them.
Thanks, guys. Piotr from a crisis group. We've chatted on Twitter a couple of times. Appreciate your sensitivity in navigating this. So interjoin question is basically, you know, we've touched upon a lot of examples in the past 30 years, but do you not think it's time for international law to be modernized, right? Ethnic cleansing was a term developed out of the Bosnian situation, but it's not in the Charter. And entwined to that is that at the moment we've got the UNGA, and the US has signalled that they're quite open to the idea of reforming the Security Council, which in the context of peace and security is the arbitrator of a lot of international law. So were we to get a normalization of African seats and representation, possibly India or Japan, do you think that could make any changes for international law going forward? Thank you.
Let's have the answers in reverse order. I'll deal with the media thing if you want to deal with that last question.
Why don't one of you the UNGA.
Security Council, I can take the Security Council one. I mean, I have recently, in an event, managed to speak to the president of Sierra Leone, who led the charge at the Security Council, the recent charge of the Security Council when Sierra Leone was on it. Quite a historical moment, because Sierra Leone was actually the president of the Security Council in the month of August, and they pushed hard for an African seat, which, as you know, the US kind of agreed to. Agreed to the idea of adding African states. I mean, I think the Security Council is, from what we've seen, and my experience in Syria, the flip chart and the flip situation in Palestine, is that we keep getting vetoes the moment we want to access some of the criminal organizations, institutions that we have created. So, for example, again on the radio, when a caller called and saying, "Is the ICC being anti-Semitic by going after Netanyahu and not Assad?" Right? And as a Syrian, I pulled over, I called into LBC because I said, I have to comment on this. I didn't get through, you'd have to know. But as I wanted to come through, it was because the Security Council blocked the ICC referral that we had. The ICC does not have jurisdiction because the Security Council, because obviously, first and foremost, Syria does not put itself, the Syrian regime does not allow the court to have access. But then the Security Council, when the world tried to refer the matter in 2014, got double vetoed, got Russia and Chinese veto. Today we're getting US vetoes, UK abstentions, and French 4, which is also a quite interesting dynamic as to see how these things matter. So clearly we do have a problem at the Security Council, and clearly there's more space to kind of do some reform. But when I read the fine line as to what the US has agreed to when it comes to Africa, is increasing the permanent seats, but not increasing the veto power. Yes. So when you read the articles, just look up exactly what they said. Is that we're not increasing the it said, quote, not quote, because there's a very kind of intentional, but close to a quote, we are not, none of the 5 will give up theirs, and adding any more will make it complex. And therefore, we do not support adding that.
Just one last note on the pernicious media. As the only member of the media on this panel, I can tell you I've been standing under a shower of shit for the last 2 weeks from the contributors from both sides in the Israel-Palestine debate, and it is the most thankless, miserable task of any of us have ever faced. And the only indication that we're doing the right thing is that both sides are contributing to that shit shower. Thank you all very, very much for your